Close your eyes and picture this. Turquoise water lapping against white sand, trade winds cutting through palm fronds, volcanic hills rising green against impossible blue sky. This is Wadadli, our own. What the Taino and Kalinago called home centuries before a lost Italian navigator squinted at it from a ship deck and decided it needed a European name. Antigua sits in the Lesser Antilles, flanked by Montserrat to the southwest and Barbuda to the north, a 108-square-mile jewel that became a laboratory for empire's ugliest experiments. The Spanish saw it in 1493 and kept sailing. Indigenous defenses were too organized, too committed. The English arrived in 1632 and stayed, transforming paradise into a sugar factory powered by stolen African lives. But here's what the colonial record loves to bury. Wadadli never stopped resisting. From Prince Claus's 1736 conspiracy to Samuel Henry's chapel organizing in the 1830s, from maroons vanishing into boggy peaks ridges to dockworkers carrying revolutionary news between islands, Antigua became the place where empire's confidence met Caribbean strategy. Bartolomé de las Casas wrote in his Historia de las Indias that the Kalinago preferred death to domination, a warning Britain should have heeded. Because every rebellion, every escape, every midnight meeting built toward November 1, 1981, when Antigua lowered the Union Jack for the last time. The island Britain called secure was never secure. It was watching, waiting, planning. And when the moment came, it was ready. The archaeological record speaks clearly. Wadadli was home long before Europe invented the concept of discovery. Sites at Elliott's, Indian Creek, and Jolly Beach reveal indigenous occupation stretching back at least 3,000 years, with Arawak-speaking communities establishing permanent settlements by around 600 CE. These weren't wandering bands. They were sophisticated societies practicing sustainable agriculture, creating intricate pottery, developing trade networks across islands, and maintaining oral histories that shaped Caribbean identity for generations. By 800 CE, Taino villages dotted Antigua's coastline, their inhabitants fishing in reef-rich waters, cultivating cassava and sweet potato, and perfecting the pepper pot stew that remains iconic centuries later. Daily life followed natural rhythms. Cassava bread baking on hot stones, children racing along beaches, communal ceremonies where drums hollowed from tree trunks carried songs into humid nights. Women managed complex horticultural systems using canuco mounds that maximized yield while maintaining soil health. Agricultural engineering that sustained populations for centuries. Taino Zemi carvings, spiritual objects representing ancestral beings, reveal a cosmology where forests, caves, and clouds held divine presences, where the natural and supernatural intertwined seamlessly. These weren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated theological frameworks explaining existence, death, renewal, and community responsibility. Around the 1200s, the Kalinago arrived. Maritime masters who navigated the Lesser Antilles in sleek canoes carved from single trees, establishing trade routes and kinship networks that European chroniclers would later mischaracterize as warfare. The Kalinago weren't conquerors. They were negotiators, traders, and when necessary, defenders of communities they'd built through careful diplomacy. Spanish accounts loved painting them as hostile savages, but considering what Spain brought, disease, enslavement, genocide, that's projection with a capital P. Wadadli thrived without written archives, but Spanish priest Bartolomé de las Casas recorded what happened when Europeans arrived. Resistance, fierce and strategic, communities choosing death over submission. His writings, composed between 1527 and 1561, read like horror reports from the front lines of genocide, documenting torture methods, mass killings, and the systematic destruction of societies Spain deemed obstacles to profit. November 1493 brought trouble. Christopher Columbus, on his second voyage with 17 ships carrying priests, soldiers, and Spain's full imperial ambitions, sighted Antigua and named it Santa Maria de la Antigua, after a Sevillan church, because apparently the Spanish protocol was Sea Island, immediately erase its actual name. Here's the irony: Columbus never landed. Why? Kalinago coastal defenses were so organized, so clearly ready to reject uninvited guests, that Spain's great explorer decided discretion beat valor and kept sailing. The first European documentation of Antigua basically reads, "Beautiful island, excellent harbors, 1010, absolutely not getting off this boat." But Spain's absence didn't mean safety, it meant delay. The pattern unleashed across the Caribbean arrived anyway. Smallpox, influenza, measles spreading faster than Spanish boots, turning indigenous bodies into biological battlegrounds for diseases their immune systems had never encountered. European germs were more effective than European guns, and by the early 1600s, Antigua's indigenous population had been decimated. Not vanished, decimated, meaning destroyed by calculated violence and epidemiological catastrophe. A 1617 Spanish report described Antigua as uninhabited except for wild cattle, which is the colonial equivalent of committing genocide and then blaming nature for the empty landscape. Las Casas, increasingly furious with his own empire, wrote that Spain's Caribbean actions were cruel, horrible, and detestable to every humane heart, documenting torture, enslavement, and mass death with the precision of a man who'd seen too much and couldn't stay silent. He recorded specific incidents: children killed for sport, adults worked to death in mines, communities burned when they refused cooperation, women violated systematically as terror tactic. Pockets of mixed Taíno-Kalinago survivors persisted in Antigua's interior well past when official records declared them extinct, living in small communities, adapting, resisting the erasure that colonialism insisted was inevitable. But by 1632, Antigua's demographic transformation was underway. The island entered European consciousness not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Empty land ready for profit, conveniently forgetting the people who'd called it home for millennia. By 1632, English settlers from St. Kitts, led by Governor Edward Warner, claimed Antigua for the crown with all the confidence of people who believed finding land meant owning it. Their initial letters home read like colonial Yelp reviews. "The land is good. We need more labor. Send supplies immediately." Translation: we have no idea what we're doing, but we're determined to profit regardless of consequences. The first English Antiguans tried cultivating tobacco with indigenous survivors and indentured servants from Ireland and Britain. Poor Europeans tricked or coerced into brutal labor contracts, promising freedom after 7 years. These workers faced horrific conditions: minimal food, physical punishment, disease, and planters who routinely extended contracts through invented debts. But their servitude was temporary. The plantation system demanded something permanent, something scalable, something that could sustain industrial agriculture without negotiation or end dates. The answer arrived in the 1640s when parish ledgers from St. John's first recorded the purchase of enslaved Africans. By 1674, sugarcane arrived, and when sugar arrived, everything transformed. Antigua's economy, landscape, demographics, and future bent entirely toward extraction. Governor Christopher Codrington, whose name haunts Antiguan history like a recurring nightmare, wrote enthusiastically in 1698 that Antigua had the best soil for cane in the Caribbean and recommended tripling slave imports to maximize production. His letters casually discuss punishment schedules, food rations, and managing Negroes, with the same tone someone might use for livestock inventory. Codrington's estate, sprawling, profitable, brutal, would later become ground zero for rebellion, though he never imagined enslaved Africans might have opinions about their enslavement or the capacity to organize sophisticated resistance. The English didn't merely colonize Antigua. They re-engineered it, transforming a diverse ecosystem into monoculture hell, importing thousands of people stolen from West and Central Africa to work land stolen from indigenous communities. By 1700, Antigua had become precisely what empire wanted: a profit-generating machine where human suffering converted directly into British wealth, where screams from boiling houses mixed with church bells on Sunday mornings, where the contradiction between Christian morality and industrial torture somehow never troubled planter consciences. Sugar didn't arrive in Antigua like a crop. It arrived like a hurricane, reshaping everything in its path. By 1674, sugar cultivation had transformed the island into an industrial complex requiring mills, boiling houses, endless timber for fuel, and enslaved labor working under conditions that would make modern readers physically ill. English planters, Codrington chief among them, imported thousands of enslaved Africans from the Bight of Benin, Gold Coast, and Congo regions, forcibly creating new demographics. By 1700, Antigua held more than 20,000 enslaved people and fewer than 3,000 Europeans. That's a 7-to-1 ratio, the kind of numbers that should have terrified plantation owners daily. It did. A 1682 plantation ledger from Codrington's estate lists punishments with accounting precision. 20 lashes for absence, 60 lashes for insolence, branding for runaway, followed immediately by 1 barrel saltfish for Christmas ration. This is how plantation records work: cruelty beside commerce, torture beside inventory, violence normalized as business expense. Enslaved Antiguans worked sunrise to sunset cutting cane with machetes that dulled quickly in tough stalks, hauling bundles weighing 60 pounds or more, feeding mills where arms could be caught in rollers, and tending boiling houses where temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity made every breath a struggle. Nights brought minimal rest in cramped quarters. Sundays brought cultural survival. Akan stories, Congo spiritual practices, drumming, dancing, these weren't leisure activities, but resistance, keeping memory and identity alive when the system tried shredding both. Obeah practitioners maintained West African spiritual traditions, adapting Vodun and indigenous beliefs to Caribbean contexts, providing healing, counsel, and sometimes strategic advice for resistance, and resistance began immediately. Tools mysteriously broke at crucial moments. Cane fires mysteriously started during harvest season. Workers mysteriously fell ill when labor demands peaked. Slowdowns, sabotage, strategic noncompliance, small acts with massive cumulative meaning. Planters called it laziness. Historians call it guerrilla warfare. The sugar boom made Britain obscenely rich while making Antigua increasingly ungovernable, creating the exact conditions that birth revolutions, concentrated populations, shared suffering, and enough contact between estates to build networks. Colonial authorities could never fully surveil. By the early 1700s, British officials bragged that Antigua was their gateway colony, profitable, well-fortified, strategically positioned. Yes, fortified, because they were terrified. The enslaved population kept growing, Small, isolated estates created perfect conditions for covert organizing, and planters' paranoia increased proportionally to their profits. Governor Daniel Parke, in a 1709 report shortly before his own settlers assassinated him in 1710, they hated him that much, complained about insolence and confederacy among the Negroes, noting they obey commands but never with heart. Oral traditions from this period speak of early maroon formations, small bands escaping into Antigua's bushy interior near Boggy Peak, moving quietly through terrain they knew intimately, raiding estates for tools and food, vanishing before patrols arrived. But the major explosion came in 1736 with the Prince Claus conspiracy, one of the Caribbean's most sophisticated rebellion plans. Prince Claus, also called Court, had been born in the Gold Coast and enslaved on the Tibu estate near St. John's. Called a king by fellow Africans, likely actual royalty from the Akan people, he coordinated a plan of stunning ambition. Strike during an elaborate ball celebrating King George II's coronation when planters and militia would be drunk and distracted. Seize the weapons cache at Fort James, torch St. John's to create chaos, and trigger simultaneous uprisings across every parish. The plan involved hundreds of participants across dozens of estates, organized through careful recruitment, coded messages, and strategic timing. Court transcripts from 1736 reveal colonial panic. Had not God revealed this plot through loyal servants, the entire island would have been lost to massacre and ruin. Translation: had one person not snitched, we were finished. The conspiracy was betrayed days before execution by an enslaved man hoping to secure his own freedom. Over 88 enslaved people were executed, some broken on the wheel, others burned alive. Prince Claus killed with deliberate brutality meant to terrorize survivors. But the plan's scale shook London to its core. It proved that plantation order was fragile illusion maintained through constant violence. That enslaved Africans possessed strategic brilliance colonial racism insisted was impossible, and that Antigua would never be as secure as Britain pretended. Parliament debated abandoning the island entirely. They didn't. Sugar profits were too valuable. But 1736 permanently destroyed the myth of enslaved docility. After 1736, Britain doubled down. More patrols, more laws, more surveillance infrastructure designed to prevent exactly what had nearly happened. Antigua's legislature passed the Consolidated Slave Act in 1737, tightening movement restrictions, criminalizing gatherings of more than 5 enslaved people without white supervision, and establishing permanent militia companies funded by new taxes. But rebellion doesn't vanish when suppressed. It adapts, finding new channels, new methods, new disguises. The Church of England's Codrington College in Barbados, funded by Antiguan plantation profits, owned hundreds of enslaved people while simultaneously preaching Christian brotherhood, a contradiction Anglican missionaries navigated with impressive cognitive dissonance. Baptism registries from the 1740s list enslaved children like property notes. Negro boy Tom, Negro girl Patience, property of Codrington Trust. Missionary William Dunbar, stationed in Antigua in 1744, wrote privately, "The people appear oppressed beyond endurance, yet they endure with dignity that shames their masters." He added immediately after, "The planters will not bend, convinced that mercy breeds rebellion." Colonial rigidity is a theme here. Spoiler, it doesn't end well for planters. Meanwhile, African cultural practices persisted despite every prohibition. Vodun rituals quietly adapted to Caribbean contexts. Akan naming ceremonies survived. Night gatherings criminalized by law continued anyway, Because community building is resistance. Instruments like the boule drum and early fife and drum formations became coded communication systems, operating literally under planters' noses. Music carrying messages colonial ears couldn't decode. A 1752 St. Mary's parish record charges an enslaved woman named Amba with keeping midnight assemblies and inciting disorder through heathen practices, which colonial language translates to, she was organizing, teaching, building networks that threatened plantation control. What authorities called disorder was actually strength, knowledge sharing, strategy sessions, sometimes rebellion planning. By 1760, the same year Tacky's revolt exploded in Jamaica with coordinated attacks across multiple parishes. Antigua's labor force was overwhelmingly African-born or first-generation Creole African, fluent in both Caribbean survival strategies and African resistance traditions. The island simmered constantly, a pot Britain insisted wasn't boiling while frantically trying to keep the lid on. By 1760, enslaved Antiguans knew the island's topography better than planters who claimed ownership. Antigua lacked Jamaica's extensive mountain forests, but it had something nearly as effective: dense interior scrub, steep gullies, volcanic ridges around Boggy Peak, terrain perfect for disappearing, regrouping, and launching guerrilla operations. Small maroon communities emerged here, never as large as Jamaica's organized maroon towns, but agile, disciplined, and impossible to eradicate. Colonial patrol logs from 1762 literally read, "We traced their fires, but not their feet. They vanish like spirits into terrain we cannot navigate." Translation: we were confused, exhausted, and comprehensively outsmarted. Leaders like King London, recorded in oral history but barely in archives, organized these hill communities, conducting nighttime raids on estates, liberating tools, livestock, and sometimes people. Planters called them bandits. Everyone else recognized them as freedom fighters. Throughout the 1760s and 1770s, Antigua's Maroons coordinated with estate-based rebels through elaborate networks involving enslaved artisans, market women who moved freely between estates selling produce, boatmen who carried information between islands, and coopers who traveled repairing barrels and spreading news. Resistance wasn't isolated incidents, but organized campaign, information flowing through channels colonial authorities couldn't infiltrate despite constant surveillance. The effect? Governors fortified St. John's with additional cannon batteries, increased militia patrols to nightly sweeps, raised taxes to fund round-the-clock surveillance that drained colonial coffers. Nothing says secure colony like spending your entire budget looking over your shoulder. Antigua's Maroons never controlled territory the way Jamaican Maroons did, never signed treaties or gained official recognition, but they maintained continuous pressure on plantation infrastructure for decades. Freedom doesn't always look like a fortress. Sometimes it looks like knowing the hills better than the soldiers hunting you, like moving through darkness with confidence while armed patrols stumble through unfamiliar terrain, like surviving another day when empire insists you shouldn't exist at all. The late 1700s delivered a triple catastrophe: hurricanes, famine, and the Haitian Revolution breathing existential dread down every colonial governor's neck. The Great Hurricane of 1780, still among the Caribbean's deadliest, flattened estates, killed thousands, and shredded sugar infrastructure across the Lesser Antilles. Colonial records document at least 4,500 deaths, though the real number was certainly higher since enslaved populations were routinely undercounted. Antigua's plantation system collapsed temporarily, and suddenly enslaved laborers were rebuilding the very infrastructure of their oppression without additional compensation. Food shortages followed naturally, Planters hoarded rations while enslaved people starved, the combustible combination historians warn about. By 1790, Governor Thomas Pitt's letters reveal increasing paranoia about night gatherings, illegal assemblies, and foreign doctrines. Delicate phrasing for Haiti just happened, and we're absolutely terrified the same could happen here. One 1791 militia report mentions enslaved cooperative workers intercepted with charcoal-written papers containing discourse on liberty and the rights of African peoples, influenced by sailors carrying news of Toussaint Louverture and Saint-Domingue's 1791 uprising. The papers quoted revolutionary language, discussed natural rights, and referenced successful black military leadership, ideas plantation systems couldn't tolerate. Then came 1804 and 1805, when coordinated work stoppages and estate sabotage flared across Antigua. Planters minimized these incidents in official correspondence. Britain hated admitting instability in its supposedly model colony. But court minutes from 1805 list 22 enslaved Antiguans tried for combination to subvert order and incite fellow laborers to violence. Translation: organizing collectively, the thing plantation systems fear most. The cases were buried in bureaucratic language, but the pattern was unmistakable. Antigua's enslaved population was watching Haiti, learning from Haiti, and considering whether Haiti's path might work here too. Sometimes rebellion looks like fire and machetes. Sometimes it looks like whispers, papers passed in darkness, and hunger sharpening the collective will to fight. Both are equally dangerous to empire. The 1816 Busa Rebellion in Barbados sent shockwaves through the British Caribbean. Antigua was only 140 miles away, close enough for news to travel fast via sailors, carpenters, and enslaved dock workers who moved routinely between islands. St. John's Colonial Council met 3 times in 1 week after hearing the news, their minutes reading like panicked group chat. All Negroes must be accounted for immediately. We must watch the chapels closely, increase patrols, restrict Sunday movement. Chapels, increasingly the organizational heart of Antiguan resistance. Christianity had become a central tool for enslaved Antiguans, not because planters encouraged it, but because people repurposed it brilliantly. By 1820, Methodist and Moravian chapels functioned as political classrooms, where literacy spread, where legal concepts were discussed, where collective identity strengthened. Enslaved preachers like Samuel Papa Henry delivered sermons that sounded harmless to casual observers, but doubled as strategic briefings, coded warnings about upcoming surveillance, discussions about natural rights framed as biblical interpretation, quiet planning sessions disguised as Bible study. Methodist missionary James Cox wrote in 1825, "The people gather in great numbers. Their spirit is restless, though not malicious. They seek knowledge with fervor that troubles the planters." Planters repeatedly warned Cox to moderate his teachings and stop encouraging literacy. He didn't. Meanwhile, on estates like Greencastle and Parham, enslaved craftsmen developed sophisticated communication networks using market routes, fishing boats, and Sunday travel passes that technically allowed religious movement. It wasn't a single conspiracy brewing, but dozens of micro-resistances, all coordinated loosely, all building towards something larger. Planters noticed the shift: more insolence, more refusals of extra labor, more demands for basic dignity, but couldn't identify the organizational structure because it was deliberately diffuse, designed to survive betrayal and continue functioning even when leaders were arrested. Freedom movements thrive where empires can't see the complete picture. And in early 1830s, Antigua, Nothing hid strategy better than a hymn sung in three-part harmony, with subversive lyrics only the singers understood. The years between 1831 and 1834 crackled with electricity. Parliament debated abolition in London while Antigua's enslaved population prepared for it with clarity. British officials consistently underestimated. Samuel Papa Henry's St. John's congregation doubled in size, cramming into a chapel built for 200, with over 400 attending services. Midnight meetings increased, despite patrol attempts to stop them. Plantation managers complained that enslaved workers were talking excessively of freedom and refusing tasks beyond contracted labor, a subtle form of resistance that undermined productivity without providing clear grounds for punishment. One estate log from 1832 notes, "The Negroes say freedom is the new year and no sooner. They will not be persuaded otherwise." They meant January 1st, 1834, having somehow learned parliamentary debate schedules before many planters did. When Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, most colonies implemented apprenticeship, basically slavery with better branding, forcing formerly enslaved people to work unpaid for former owners for 4 to 6 years. But Antigua shocked everyone by announcing immediate, full emancipation, effective August 1st, 1834. Why? Officially, planters argued Antigua was small, orderly, and ready for free labor. Honestly, they feared mass rebellion if they tried enforcing apprenticeship on people who'd been organizing for years and who outnumbered Europeans 7-1. Britain recorded Antigua's Emancipation Day as peaceful and orderly, but private diaries tell different stories. Tens of thousands gathering in chapels before dawn, drums rolling across the countryside in patterns that sounded like celebration, but could quickly shift to warning. Estate watchmen nervously alert. Planters sleeping with loaded guns nearby. And in the quiet hours before sunrise on August 1st, 1834, an unnamed woman on a rural estate was recorded saying simply, "Tonight, we are people. Not property, not slaves, people." The statement captures everything: joy, relief, exhaustion, defiance, victory that came at incomprehensible cost. Emancipation didn't arrive because Britain's conscience evolved. It arrived because Caribbean people made slavery too expensive, too dangerous, too politically unstable to maintain. When sunrise arrived August 1st, 1834, Antigua stood alone, the only major British Caribbean colony granting immediate full emancipation, skipping apprenticeship entirely. Britain celebrated this as proof of colonial benevolence and enlightened governance. Let's be clear, this was calculated self-interest. Planters were terrified that forcing years more unpaid labor on people who'd organized sophisticated resistance networks for decades would trigger island-wide rebellion that militia forces couldn't contain. But emancipation didn't magically fix anything. Formerly enslaved Antiguans had freedom without land, wages without leverage, rights without enforcement mechanisms or legal recourse when violated. Plantation owners immediately formed informal cartels, keeping wages insultingly low. Some paid sixpence daily, irregularly, often in plantation tokens rather than actual currency. Others returned to familiar tactics, controlling housing access since most workers still lived in estate quarters, monopolizing food distribution through plantation shops, and using vagrancy laws criminalizing unemployment to effectively force people back onto estates under slightly modified but still exploitative terms. An 1838 magistrate entry charges a woman named Nanny Warner with idleness and refusing honest labor, meaning she refused plantation work at exploitative wages while seeking better opportunities. She said in court, "If this is freedom, it is a small thing. We have traded chains for hunger. That line deserves remembering. Freedom without economic autonomy is freedom with asterisks, liberty that exists on paper but struggles in practice. Cane fires increased mysteriously throughout the late 1830s, all officially accidental, all conveniently suspicious, all occurring during crucial harvest periods. Workers negotiated collectively for the first time in Antiguan history, refusing unpaid overtime, demanding actual currency instead of plantation tokens only redeemable at estate shops that charged inflated prices. Churches remained political centers where organizing continued. Education spread rapidly through grassroots networks as formerly enslaved people pursued literacy with intensity that troubled authorities. Formerly enslaved Antiguans built free villages like Freetown, founded in 1834, where land ownership symbolized real autonomy and communities governed themselves. As emancipated Antiguans demanded higher pay and workplace protections through the 1840s and 1850s, planters deployed capitalism's oldest union-busting tactic, importing cheaper labor to undermine bargaining power. Between 1850 and 1880, Britain brought small numbers of Portuguese Madeirans and South Asian indentured laborers to Antigua, hoping to recreate exploitative labor systems with new populations. Indenture wasn't slavery. Contracts theoretically ended after 5 to 7 years. Wages theoretically got paid regularly. But it wasn't freedom with benefits either. Contracts trapped workers in low wages, strict supervision that resembled plantation oversight, and restricted movement enforced through debt mechanisms and contractual penalties. Portuguese laborer Manuel da Costa wrote in an 1862 complaint to the colonial office, "The work is heavier than promised, and the overseer strikes men without cause or warning. We are treated little better than the slaves before us." His complaint went nowhere. Colonial officials sided with planters as usual. Meanwhile, Afro-Antiguans built new political consciousness through friendly societies, burial lodges that provided death benefits and mutual support, savings cooperatives that pooled resources for land purchases, and church committees that coordinated community action. Mutual aid networks, Britain constantly underestimated as merely social rather than political. These were incubators for future labor movements, teaching collective organizing, financial cooperation, and political leverage that would transform Antiguan society. By the late 1800s, Antigua's sugar economy was crumbling under competition from European beet sugar and more efficient Cuban production using newer technology. Mills closed, estates consolidated into fewer hands, poverty deepened across rural communities. Colonial reports from the 1890s warned repeatedly of workers becoming dangerously dissatisfied with wages and conditions, as if hunger and exploitation naturally bred contentment. Then came 1918 and 1920, food shortages exacerbated by World War I disruptions, skyrocketing prices as merchants hoarded supplies, stagnant wages that hadn't increased despite inflation. People rioted in St. John's markets. Crowds overturned stalls linked to merchants hoarding supplies, while workers starved. The colonial governor described unrest as serious agitation among the Negro population, showing ingratitude for opportunities provided, framing hunger as character flaw rather than economic reality created by systematic exploitation. Amid turbulence rose future leaders, teachers, artisans, preachers, union organizers, who understood the core problem wasn't food scarcity, but power distribution that concentrated wealth upward while forcing poverty downward. Modern Antiguan politics begins with one name, Vere Cornwall Bird. Born in 1910 to working-class parents, Bird grew up witnessing the contradictions of post-emancipation Antigua. technically free, practically constrained. He joined the Antigua Trades and Labor Union in the 1940s and spearheaded strikes that finally shattered planter dominance after centuries of exploitation. In 1943, sugar workers shut down estates across the island, refusing to work until wages increased and conditions improved. When police tried stopping them, thousands marched anyway, flooding St. John's streets in the largest demonstration colonial authorities had ever seen. One colonial officer wrote, "The island is in serious turmoil. The workers appear united in demands we cannot meet without fundamentally altering economic structures." Appear, sir, they were united, definitively, strategically, victoriously, organized through unions that planters couldn't intimidate or buy off. By 1951, Antigua held its first election under universal adult suffrage, extending voting rights to all adults, regardless of property ownership or gender. The ATLU swept parliamentary seats in landslide victory. Workers' voices were suddenly in government, a transformation unthinkable a century earlier when voting required property qualifications that excluded most Antiguans. Yet independence's path was messy, complicated by regional politics and British reluctance. Antigua joined the West Indies Federation in 1958, an ambitious attempt at regional Caribbean unity, bringing together 10 British territories into single political entity. But the Federation collapsed by 1962 after internal tensions over governance structures, economic policies, and Britain's reluctance to commit genuine autonomy or financial support. The dream of united Caribbean independence stepped back, but didn't die, remaining aspiration even as individual islands pursued separate paths. Through the 1960s and 1970s, Antigua navigated Cold War geopolitics that pressured small islands to align with superpowers, regional nationalism that emphasized Caribbean identity, and Britain's impressive talent for bureaucratic delay whenever independence discussions accelerated. The island gained associated statehood in 1967, self-governance in domestic affairs, while Britain retained control over defense and foreign relations, a halfway status that satisfied neither side completely. Finally, November 1, 1981, brought full independence after years of negotiation. Fireworks lit St. John's Harbor, reflecting off water that had carried slave ships, merchant vessels, and now witnessed freedom. Steel pan echoed through streets, the distinctly Caribbean sound that originated in Trinidad but resonated across islands. Elders born under colonial rule lived to see their own national flag, rising sun on black, blue, and white, rise over government buildings for the first time. Veer Bird became the first Prime Minister of independent Antigua and Barbuda. The moment carried centuries of struggle, from Taino resistance against Spanish invasion to Prince Claus's conspiracy that nearly succeeded, from Maroons in Boggy Peak to Samuel Henry's chapel organizing that prepared people for freedom, from emancipation's complicated promises to labor strikes that proved collective power could transform society. Stand on a ridge near Boggy Peak at sunset, and light hits the hills in ways that feel ancient. Wind cuts through acacia trees, and if you listen long enough, you can almost hear the rhythm beneath it. Hum of work songs that sustained people through impossible labor, crackle of cane fires both accidental and strategic, footsteps of Maroons slipping into brush while patrols searched desperately. Below spreads the island, old estates broken into villages where descendants of enslaved people now own land, chapels rebuilt repeatedly that served as schools and political headquarters, roads named after people governors once feared. Every inch of Antigua carries memory of people who refused to bow, from Prince Claus coordinating conspiracy across estates to Papa Henry preaching freedom in biblical language. From unnamed women who said, "Tonight we are people," to union workers who shut down sugar production until justice arrived. Empires arrived with maps and muskets and absolute certainty about their right to rule. Antiguans answered with strategy, spirit, and centuries of resistance that moved through darkness, organized in chapels, planned in whispers, and survived when survival seemed impossible. The British claimed they'd built a model colony, demonstrating enlightened governance. What they actually built was a pressure cooker that finally, inevitably, exploded into independence. The mountain is quiet now, but the silence isn't empty. It's full of people, still standing, still resisting, still here.